welcome to Positive Regard presents a conversation with. In this episode, we've got Dave Whitaker with us, and we're going to be looking at values, which is a bit of a broad subject, but absolutely, when I think values, I think Dave. Both Luke and myself have been really lucky to spend quite a lot of time working alongside Dave over the last few years. So it's quite exciting, actually. I've been really looking forward to doing this. We'll get cracked off straight into it. I think one of the things that'd be really good for people to just hear a little bit about yourself, Dave, a bit of an introduction, because I'm mindful that a lot of people that watch this might not know who you are.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's a little bit of a nostalgia trip for us, isn't it? So we can have a nostalgic trip down memory lane. I think, to give anybody watching some context, my background, I started life as a secondary geography teacher, town centre Barnsley, a school with 1,600 kids, and very quickly, having found my feet as a geography teacher, I found myself working in what can only broadly be described as inclusion. And I was lucky enough to sort of shift into pastoral work really, really quickly, having only been a class teacher for a couple of years. And I found my direction quite early in my career. And that naturally led me into special educational needs, to the point where I was working at a senior level within that organisation with responsibility for inclusion and SEND, which then led to a sort of a natural progression, I suppose, natural but accidental in my case, into working at a senior level, initially as an executive deputy head in SEMH, which was in those days, which makes me feel old, BESD, but an SEMH school and what was also then a pupil referral unit. So I'm working in the maintain system. And then from there, through the process of academisation, working on a broader level with Wellspring Academy Trust, setting up the teaching school, becoming a teaching school, because the teaching school was linked to the outstanding SEMH provision, and hence where Positive Regard came from, because it came actually initially out of Barnsley Teaching School Alliance, which we set up. I'm going to say 9-10 years ago, which we ran successfully as a teaching school for a long time until everything changed, and teaching schools have now gone into these hubs, and we're now working. Obviously, the three of us have not only worked in the same school together, the same trust, but now we're sort of working together as part of our Positive Regard team. That's a snapshot.
In it, absolutely. Luke, I'd be really interested to hear your sort of first interactions with Dave and how that's changed from now to all those years ago.
My first interactions with Dave, I was probably a really cheeky 17-year-old who would just come on working as supply in this SEMH provision, and I remember standing behind Dave in the lunch queue and not knowing who he was. And I remember, I think I must have said something, Dave, that was completely inappropriate to say to your boss at the time. I probably included a swear word or two, and you challenged me in such a way where I knew that what I'd done wasn't appropriate, but also I didn't feel really bad about it either. And then you literally introduce yourself as I'm Dave, I'm the deputy head, and I was like, oh, hi, you're right, Dave. Apologies for that. That was my first interaction with you, Dave.
I can't remember that exact interaction. I'd be probably quite like to know about that later. Probably appropriate for us to discuss now. But I do remember. At that time, I do remember you coming, Luke, because we were really, really struggling with one really particular child, and we needed to give that kid something we didn't have at our disposal. And I think that when you arrived, one of the things we did was we were just trying stuff, because I think what I found with my career in SEMH and AP is, if I'd have known now what I knew then, I'd have known then what I know now, I think the job probably would have been a damn sight easier, but we just didn't know stuff like we do know now. And however, that said, one of the things that I am really pleased about is a lot of the stuff we did back then, we actually accidentally did right. So things like relational practice, we did really good relational practice without knowing it was really good relational practice, or without anybody telling us it was really good relational practice. We even did really good restorative practice without knowing it was restorative practice. It was just the way we were, hence that those whole conversations that you talk about culture and values and how you generate those values from what you want to achieve, even if somebody's not telling you how to do it.
I remember those days well. I remember trying a number of things and thinking nothing's working with this kid. I know one thing that we didn't try though, or we didn't ever go down, was the sort of like sanctions-based route, because even though we didn't necessarily have the skills, there was a fundamental in the school that we were relational based and values and just decent really and nice to the kids. And we always said, like, if we rate with them, they rate with us. And I know it's a proper old Barnsley saying, but even though we didn't necessarily have the skills, or I certainly didn't have the skills, it made a lot of sense to me, just knowing the direction of the culture in the school and how our interaction should be with the children. That really helped.
I think, to be honest, Lou, that thing about if you're right with me, I'll be right with you. I used to actually use that phrase with children, and that was almost my introduction to Barnsley restorative practice. Because I used to say to the kids, literally, and I'll translate it now for those people who aren't from Barnsley. I used to say to the kids, if you're okay with me, then I will be okay with you back. It's as simple as that. So therefore, that was the basis of building relationships. But I used to say it in Barnsley by saying, if you're right with me, I'll be right with thee. and actually, sitting in a room with a child who's just been through some sort of incident, it's amazing how just saying that used to level it off straight away. And they genuinely used to believe that you meant that, and you know what? I did. I genuinely mean it.
They knew that as well, didn't they? And they knew that, and even when they weren't at the best or feeling like they could berate with us, they knew that we would be there for them and would rock up every day. And I remember that kid that you're talking about that I had to work with, and I remember getting some really tough days where at the end of the day I'm thinking, do I come back to work? This is really challenging, but we did, and we rocked up every single day. Again, not necessarily having all the skills that we have now, but we were still doing them, and we put them into place. And it was only later on, I think, when we figured out the theory behind it all, we could make the link really, really clearly then to what we were doing in practice.
I think what's really important is what you just said then, Luke, is that even when things were really, really difficult with him, we never gave up.
No.
And what we used to do was always review what we've done and then work out what we could do next. And one of the ways that I sort of describe that when I'm talking to schools or leaders or staff is that what we used to do is if you think about you climbing up a ladder and you're going from rung to rung on a ladder, trying something on every rung, when you got to the top, instead of falling off the edge, we'd start the ladder again and start going up the ladder again, or we'd try and build some more rungs. So what we would never do is we never got to a cliff edge with these kids. And as difficult as they were, we always used to sort of roll our sleeves up, look out for each other and say, like, what can we try different next week that we haven't tried this week? And that was without knowing all the stuff we know now about, and we didn't know the stuff about trauma. We didn't know the stuff about ACEs. We didn't know all the theories and backgrounds and neuroscience that we happily, all three of us happily talk about now. We just did things right, and it worked on occasions. When it worked, we did more of it, and when it didn't work, we didn't do it again. That's how we tried it.
I think one of my first interactions with you, Dave, was sort of setting the weather at the beginning of the year. So I remember starting at Springwell as not dissimilar to Luke, as probably a teenager. And again, I'm sort of drawing us back to the value stuff here. I absolutely did not know any of the stuff that I know now. I didn't know anything to do with ACEs, trauma, adversity, attachment styles, anything like that. It was really clear from the offset that you were going to be leading us with values at the core of everything. Where did that come from? Where do your values come from? But where does your tie to relational practice, even if you didn't know what that was at the time, where does all that come from? That's quite a big question, I think, but I'm really interested to know.
Do you know what? I think I've thought about this a lot, and there are certain points in your career sometimes you can think of which were really key points, but almost like game changers. And I would say that for me, as a relational practitioner, I have to go all the way back to right at the start of my career, working in a school which was quite tough with some quite tough kids, and very, very quickly realizing that detentions weren't going to change them. And, we had this system of where if you were a teacher in a classroom, you could get these little pink slips out and you could write these little pink slips, and they were you two won't remember the concept of carbonated paper, but what you used to do is you used to write a slip. One of them was you'd give to the kid, saying you've got a detention, and the other one you put in a box in the staff room, and then that was recorded, and they had to turn up to this detention, and some teachers used to do about 50 of these a day. You know, they used to have, we were all given a pad, a detention pad, where you could write detentions on. I think in my 10 years in that school, I think I wrote 2 of those detention slips, and both of them were probably in my first 5 weeks. And then I realized, what is all this about? And I don't think I did another one ever, because I just didn't see the point of it. And what I very, very quickly realized was, if you can make an emotional connection with the kids, they'll start to do what you want them to do. But then you see, you then open up this thing of, well, that means you're letting the kids get away with stuff, or you're trying to be their mate. Not at all. Not in the slightest. I'm actually making a connection with them, so they actually behave really well and work really, really hard. And it's as simple as that. I saw it working. I realized very, very quickly that I could use my relationships and my personality to really, really get the children trusting me and working for me. I was also really lucky to work in a department where we all did the same. So there was 3 or 4 of us working in that department who all were relational practitioners, just by the natural way they worked. So we had a department where we had very, very little behaviour problems, and there was chaos in other areas of the school. And so without knowing it, I became a relational practitioner. Moving on from that, 10 years later, I'm working in SEMH, and I'm working for a head teacher, you both know, Josie Thurkel, who's no longer with us, who she was the one who took a chance on me and took me into that senior role, and that's those schools. And it was her who introduced me to the concept of unconditional positive regard. And she taught me how to understand what unconditional positive regard actually is, linking it to the work of Carl Rogers and a psychotherapy counselling background. But everything she told me about unconditional positive regard, including giving me a book to read, the reason it sat with me really well was I was already doing it, but without knowing why it worked and the theory behind it. So the unconditional positive regard thing that I picked up with Josie, 15 years ago or whenever it was just easy. It was easy for me to understand and easy for me to see the benefits of it. And then immediately you're getting into, as a school leader, how do you get everybody else to buy into this?
And that was my next question. How do you now pass that on to other people? And does that still, so unconditional positive regard, does that still mean the same to you now as it did then? Or is it slightly different?
Pretty much. I think one of the things that I always believed in was not overcomplicating things.
Yeah.
So somebody can say, well, what do you understand about unconditional positive regard? And I could give you a book, couldn't I? And you could start reading a whole book, and it might take you 6 weeks to read a book and start to interpret all the background and the psychology behind it. But what I used to do is literally say to people, we're not going to overcomplicate this. There's some real basics in what Carl Rogers says. And I even now, I often just unpick them. And it's that thing about, for example, we work in a caring profession. So we caring first before GCSE results and SATs results and progress in English and math, that are all very important, very good. And this is where the problem lies, is as soon as you say that caring comes above GCSE English, people assume that you don't care about GCSE English, which is nonsense, because I actually I care about it a lot, but I think if you get the caring bit right, the English will follow. And it's trying to get people to understand that unconditional positive regard and that set of values that's associated with it doesn't mean you compromise on other stuff. It's not a trade-off. It's not you can only do one and you can't do the other. And I think that thing about working in a caring profession, and that Rogers says something around, and I don't. This might not be the exact quote from Rogers, but he says something along the lines of, "I care, not I care if you behave thus and so." So it was basically just really getting to that root of it and saying, I'm just going to care about you no matter what you do, because I'm going to carry on caring about you, and then I'm going to carry on caring about you.
Yeah, authenticity, isn't it? It's Really?
And then that links to this, what Rogers calls genuineness. And he makes a big point with, and this is going back to what you said, Jacob, about sort of setting the tone and making the weather within an organisation. One thing I was really, really clear on all the way through those times was, if you don't believe it, it won't work. So actually, if you don't believe it and it won't work, then you probably need to go and work somewhere else, because actually we need it to work. And I don't know if you remember, but I did used to say to people, you can go and leave. If you don't believe in what we're trying to do at this school, then please go and find a job somewhere else.
That's not a critique, is it, of them or a reflection of them as a person? It's making the job easier for you and better for the kids, because you're filling it up with the relationships.
What it did, Luke, is it allowed me to challenge people's values if I felt they were drifting along out of sync with what we believed in as a school. So there were a number of occasions where, I would say to colleagues, don't forget what we all agreed to in September. And you agreed to it because I asked you to agree to it or go and work somewhere else. And you're still here. And I did have to have a couple of those conversations, not in an aggressive way or a challenging way, but a genuine conversation. And every time those people said, yeah, Dave, I just need to reset my thinking, and this has been a really helpful conversation, and we move on. So I think so important.
One of the things that, so you kind of just getting into the realms of how you challenge people that don't have that mindset now, and you set the scene, you set the tone, and then you support them with it, you give them the option to go. I think one of the things that you did for me as well, and for my mindset, because I was naturally a behaviourist, I grew up in a behaviourist home, and my sort of initial interactions with that young person that you set me off with started out quite behaviourist because I didn't know what else to do. And they started to change over time, not necessarily through, I suppose my values just changing, but something that you supplemented or you as a leadership team did at that time was you opened our eyes to CPD and CPD opportunities, but us being able to own it as well. Like I remember us doing research and development tasks as a whole school for the year. I don't know if that was was that tactical is what my question was in terms of helping you embed and establish that culture, or was that just part of what you would do regardless if you're trying to change a culture or not?
It was tactical in the sense that we knew that we needed to be a special school full of specialists, and that we knew that you couldn't run a special school without it being full of specialists. So if you haven't already got specialists, how do you make them? Well, you train them. And one of the when people have said to me in the past and said, what would be the one thing that you think was the most important thing that you think got you to be an outstanding school? It was the CPD offer that we used to do on a Friday afternoon. We focused, and in hindsight, some of it may not have been as good as what we wanted, or some of it might not have been as focused or as structured or as organised. But what we did is we just hammered training, and we said we just need experts. We need people to listen and commit to training. And it didn't take us long to have a lot of knowledgeable people working in the building and build on that. And it didn't take us long to be able to have a good internal team of support that we could then train. We could train ourselves after a period of time. But what we did need is time to do it. And time is so precious in schools that we committed to 2 hours every Friday afternoon. And those 2 hours were going to be CPD. They weren't going to be extra PPA time. It wasn't going to be time to put up displays. It wasn't that sort of stuff. It was training every Friday afternoon. And we probably did every training every Friday afternoon for about 5 years before we started doing some little give backs.
You're both talking a little bit now about things that have enabled success in this approach, so in sort of values and relational practice. I'm interested in things that can get in the way. So what, from your experience, have been some of the biggest barriers to relational practice or to a values-driven approach?
I think, there's a couple of barriers. The first one is what Luke's already said, is that most people come from behaviourist backgrounds. So most people see the world through a behaviourist lens because we're surrounded by it. Most families have a behaviourist approach. So you grow up in a family with, if you grow up in my family and grow up in the 70s and 80s, it was, a clip round the ear, I'll do as you're told. and that's the ultimate behaviourist approach, isn't it? You just you do something wrong, you get a clip, or you get shouted at. Being shouted at was then and is still now like a default mechanism for lots of adults when they're working with children. I probably spent 20 years of my teaching career not shouting at a kid, but then finding myself shouting at my own son because of that expectation you get from your own children that they should be doing exactly what you would tell them to do because that's because you're the boss in the house and they don't. So you sort of lose it quicker with them than you do with kids at school. But in school, really controlled and unemotional. But at home, you're there. So I think the first thing for me was that the barrier is always people's predisposition. So it's what they know and what they understand about behaviour. The second one, which is huge, is behaviour policy at a government DFE, education level, where certain practices are promoted and then championed. So they aren't just there; they're championed. And I think we went through a phase in education where schools needed to be improved really, really quickly. The way to see schools being improved quickly was essentially changing the cohort. So what you do is you impose really, really tight rules. Children that can't stick to those rules end up in internal isolation, fixed term exclusions, and then permanent exclusions. Because what schools were looking for at that time is compliance at all costs. It's the era of the zero tolerance behaviour policy, the no excuses policy, and then because that was championed across the system, it's a little bit like if you can't beat them, join them. Well, if they're doing it down the road, we need to do it. Otherwise, they're going to get rid of all the kids and they're going to come to us, and then we're going to be lumbered because we're trying to do things differently. So that school goes into special measures. Therefore, it's taken over by an academy trust. They immediately come in and change it and put this in place because they're being scrutinised, and that happens. I once wrote a blog a few years ago that I called the Lance Armstrong effect, the Lance Armstrong effect for school behaviour, and the way I tried to describe it was when Lance Armstrong was operating at the top of his game, but yet he was doing drugs. What transpired was that pretty much everybody in professional cycling was doing drugs, because once one of them starts doing it, they get success. The only way you can get success is by actually joining them, by doing drugs as well. And actually what happened with those cyclists in those days was the risk of doing drugs was worth it because they were going to lose without drugs. So therefore, they wouldn't be successful as cyclists without drugs. So therefore, it was a risk they were going to take them, because what have they got to lose? And so everybody in professional cycling was taking drugs until a few of them started getting found out, and then the whole of it changed. And I feel that the link to education is that as soon as you start getting some schools that are high excluders, behaviourist approaches, zero tolerance, when they're placed on a pedestal to say that they're brilliant, then the other schools think, well, that's what we've got to do as well, like they did around Lance Armstrong when he was taking drugs. And so you've got loads of schools buying into that approach because they do, and we all know they do because we've worked in these schools, they do get quick results, they do get better standards, but what they also do is get kids having to go elsewhere.
I was reading something recently about called. I was reading a book, Simon Sinek, one of Simon Sinek's book, and I don't know whether this fits, but in my mind, I've been drawn to the phrase ethical fading, in a sense of how we want to achieve those results, and our morality and values takes a sidestep, and we go for that, like you're saying, and join the crowd, or the profit or the business sort of is going in that way rather than sort of sticking to the guns.
I think that's exactly it. I do. And I think that then that brings in even more so this lack of acceptance that we have about certain children from certain backgrounds in certain places. There's something that I've just been looking at really recently, which I find fascinating, is something that we call biased informed practice. And what we've got, we're all biased. We're naturally biased. All of us, all three of us are biased. So we have a way of thinking, and we're biased against certain people and for certain reasons. That's just as a product of our own environment and our own background. So we've got to constantly combat our own bias in order to be truly inclusive. And one of the things we have, if we're not careful in schools, is we don't accept that we're biased, and therefore compliance is something that has to happen. If we can accept that we're biased and that we view people, that some people are different, we have to view it differently, it helps us to understand where they're coming from. So having a biased informed practice is us accepting that we're biased, which is really difficult.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to say to somebody, I'm biased, mate. But you're not meaning to be biased. You just are because of, it's like if you play rugby, right, and you're surrounded by people who play rugby, and your mates play rugby, and you play rugby every week, then rugby's your favourite sport, and you actually don't like football because you're biased against football because you play rugby. But then
that's only a result of me being in that world for 10 years. It's a real reference, I suppose. As well.
So therefore, without really meaning to it, you've got a rugby bias because you've been absorbed in the world of rugby. So if a footballer comes and decides to join your team and wants to play a bit of rugby, but starts telling you that football's a little bit better than rugby and why you're all playing rugby, you immediately exclude that footballer from because of your bias. Now, if you're operating with biased informed practice and you know you're biased, what you're is more welcoming of the footballer into that circle because you're stopping yourself being biased, even though you know you are. And that comes down to that acceptance element of Rogers.
Yeah, I was going to say that it links directly into being non-judgmental, doesn't it? And taking in, and which I was going to say was one of our barriers when Jacob asked what the barriers are to relational practice. It's being a human. It's that bias that you're talking about. It's naturally being judgmental. We are all judgmental as people.
Hence, biased informed practice is where we, as practitioners, accept our bias and put it to one side.
Yeah,
which some people can't and don't do, and to us and many people, it's difficult to do so.
Yeah, and I'd say that's one of the challenges that I face when helping schools shift culture as well, that have a behaviourist culture. We're not for 1 minute to potentially going into those settings and saying, remove your system from a wall, because that would be me leaning on my bias and sort of going towards that. It's about how we support them to supplement their practice with sort of other things. But yes, it's difficult and it is a massive barrier.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we've been very, very clear about with the work that we do with Positive Regard is that we're not telling people what to do as if we've got an off-the-peg solution. Yeah. What we're saying is, be more sophisticated, think about it this way. These are some suggestions that you could try. We're not telling you to chuck everything out today and start something tomorrow. We just want you to be a little bit more
considered.
Yeah.
And we're only doing it's only off of lived experience as well, isn't it? Like, we can go back to that kid at the start, right? He made long-lasting, successful behaviour change. He's now a lifeguard at one of the Metrodome. He went through a long behavioural change. We taught him how to express himself in a more socially acceptable way over time, rather than looking for short behavioural changes by reacting to him. It's not easy and it takes time.
So the challenge, what you've got there is a challenge. I know we're going off track, but just during the recent Ofsted inspection, one of the challenges that we had in an SMH setting was to get the inspectors to see the impact that we have with the children over a long period of time. So when you're seeing this really challenging behaviour in the primary phase, dysregulated, really challenging, those children, particularly coming out the back of a 2-year pandemic, those children are really struggling to be in school. You track forward and look at the children in year 10 and 11, they're just settled and working really, really hard. They're pleasant. They have the occasional blip, but they're always going to have the occasional blip. But generally, they're settled. Now, if we play the long game in SEMH, get the kids early, get them into really good provision with really good staff doing really good stuff, you end up getting to a point at the end where they can successfully transition into the real world. Hence, the example you've just given of the child you were working with being working full-time employment and doing well now. So if we judge a school on what happens in a 20-minute lesson in an SEMH school, well, we're going nowhere with that. there's just no point in doing it. We're judging it over time and the impact we're having. We're talking about life changing over a period of time.
Yeah.
Are there any other sort of barriers that you've found that you've come up against over the course of sort of stepping into different roles potentially as well? I'm thinking leadership. How do you lead people in a values-based practice in a world that's not set up like that?
Yeah, I think there's certain there's a few little bits and pieces that I think you've got to be really conscious to do, and and a lot of it is to do is the people who you're leading understanding what they're doing, so that sense of transparency. If I'm going to ask you to do something in a certain way in school, right? Let's say around behaviour policy, it's not just telling you that's what I want you to do. It's getting you to understand that that's the right thing to do. So therefore, you're going to be 100% behind it. And I think sometimes if you miss that little phase out or don't get that little phase done properly, you start getting people doing things in the school that they don't believe in, therefore it doesn't work, which gets us back again to where we said about genuineness. So what quite often, and you two will do this when you go into schools, but I'll go into other schools, to do our work that we do in other schools, and there's immediately some people in the room that don't believe in it. My job, I see, is that in 2 hours, I'm going to try and get you to believe in it. So if I'm going to spend 2 hours working with this staff team, in 2 hours, it's the 5 people in the corner that they're more important, that we change their hearts and minds than the other 60 people who are already bought into what you're trying to do. So your training for 60 people is really for 5 of them in the corner. It's for the science department because they don't believe in anything but science. So, and I'm sorry for any science teachers that are watching. That was a joke, sort of. But so what you've got to do is when you it's almost it's like the concept of the lowest common denominator. In one way, you're never going to get everybody buying in, so you're never going to get 100% coverage. But if you can get the critical mass believing in what they're doing, then you're going to have a good chance of getting it embedded and really being able to have that sort of values-driven culture that you want within a school, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah. It does, and you know what? I don't know whether you're going to make this point, Luke. I feel like we'll be on the same wave here. But I think when you get some of that, as much of that right as you can, it really does make an environment magic to be in, and makes people want to do it for each other. We've all worked with people that are a bit grumpy, mood hoovers. We've also all worked, I suppose, with people that are the opposite of that. And both of those things that can be infectious, they can spread, and energy transfers through the team. And I remember being, in the school that we were talking about, where we all worked together, and how you wanted to do it for each other, obviously for the young people that you were working with as well. But you turned up even when you were a bit ropey, or you weren't feeling your best because you knew you needed to do it for the person that was sat next to you when you're in your briefing first thing in the morning or when you were in class. And ultimately, that for me created a real magic environment.
I wanted to link into that, Dave. I wanted to ask what does, for people that have never worked in an environment that's relational based, or what does it look like in action? If you could put yourself on a couple of sort of practical examples of good relational practice. I can think of a few off the top of my head. I'm thinking like 150 SEMH pupils in assembly. I'm thinking eating lunch with the children, like no staff sat in a staff room. We didn't have a staff room. When we built the building, we didn't make a staff room. And people sat together, and it was just every interaction was an intervention, to quote Miss Karen Treisman. But yeah.
I think you just mentioned things like lunchtimes, right? So simple things like staff eating their lunch with the children in a family dining scenario. So sitting around a table, a couple of members of staff, 5 or 6 kids, eating and chatting. What if you see that happening, and also that the staff themselves know that being there is what needs to happen for their good and for the greater good, you've more or less got it cracked, haven't you? Mm-hmm. If you see staff who feel they need to get away from the kids at lunchtime, and don't get me wrong, everybody needs a break, and you've got to factor in that concept of getting a break and getting a mental break and get a physical break and getting away from the kids. because it is a tough gig working in SEMH, and you need to stay sane, don't you, when it comes to it. But there's that, when you get that buy-in around these children, the relationships happen with these children from start to finish on the day. The relationships don't stop at any part of the day. One of the most heartwarming things for me, as a school leader, as a head teacher, as a principal, as an exec principal within those settings, is seeing those unexplainable connections that the children have with the adults in and around the school. That's not necessarily just while they're doing work in an academic way. And we used to call it intimacy, warmth, banter, and trust, didn't we? That's what we had. I love that even now. The term banter was hijacked a little bit. We went through a bit of a stage where people assumed that banter was sort of inappropriate, Mickey taking. For us, it was never Mickey taking. Banter was just a warm interplay between two people. Sometimes, I may add, between two adults in front of the children. Mm-hmm. So what you're doing is you're modelling that appropriate banter between two adults when a child is in the room. So it might be a visitor comes into the room and there is banter between the teacher and the visitor in the room that's done in front of the kids, and the kids see that that's appropriate and it's a nice thing to do because there's a warmth about it. But whenever anybody says to me about that, I always have to keep on going back to that. We're not being sarcastic. We're not taking the mickey. Yeah, we're not being inappropriate. What we're doing is we're just doing warmth.
Yeah.
That intimacy, warmth, banter, and trust, it's not made up. That's not a made up phrase. That's what's tangible within a really great school when you see it happening around you as you walk around the school.
The great clip I shared the other week, and I've started to share it every now and again on some training. Bruce Perry talking about connection and relationships. Dr. Bruce Perry, and he says it's not what you know, it's how you are, and that absolutely for me sums up, because obviously I was a part of that team at the time, because we didn't know, like we've already alluded to, we didn't know all the stuff we know now about the neurosequential model and even some of the theories behind values-based practice. But absolutely, the vast majority of the team were doing it in the right way.
And also, one of the things we used to do really well, we used to do deflection really well before we knew that deflection was a really good thing to do. I remember de-escalation through deflection being just something that I just did because I couldn't think of any other way to get a kid to regulate. So we used to do that co-regulation and that deflection, distraction, call it what you like, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 years before I read about it in a book. And it just used to come natural to the way we worked because it was a consequence of the relational practice we had in place in the school.
We accidentally stumbled across the good bits behind it though as well. Because I remember, for example, we used to send a kid to the printer to go and get a piece of paper to distract them from the learning, and they come back and still be dysregulated. And then we started getting this kid to carry a heavy box of books to the printer and then bring the heavy box of books back, or a different box of books back. And they were being more regulated. And then we started to learn the theory behind pressure and how that supports them. So we were using distractions, and then we just started to supplement it with a little bit more sophistication around what's actually helping the kid regulate. And I really like that. And I know we keep saying we used to, we still do. All the schools that I'm working in and that Jacob's working in, that you go in, Dave, these are the things that we still do. And there's lots of schools that are taking this on this journey that we're supporting as well. And they're really enjoying it, and they're seeing the impacts of it with some really, really vulnerable young people.
One of the things that I think has been really important in the work I've been doing is this whole concept of trying to understand that we're not in some sort of personal battle with children when it comes to working with kids. And I remember I probably said this in training 15 years ago. Don't get yourself into a battle with a kid. It's not about, it's not personal. Don't be looking for revenge. Don't think that kid's got something against you. And then now, when you link that up to things like polyvagal theory and all the stuff that we know, that's that, isn't it? It's that we're getting right back to children feeling safe And then that links back perfectly back to Rogers, who says that we're all about an emotional safe climate. So all this links either accidentally or perfectly aligned, links through to where we're trying to get to and what we do in schools around relational practice.
There's a couple of bits that I'm interested to hear from now. So we're touching a little bit here on sort of cynics, I suppose, aren't we? And a bit of sort of people's views that maybe sit at the other side of that spectrum. What sort of stuff do you say to those people? I know we've talked a little bit about how we work with those people in our environments, and I know obviously we sometimes do similar work going into schools, and you've got that 5% that you've described. But what things do you do to challenge the cynic in this? I don't want to say argument, conversation about approaches.
I think you've got to disarm them first, and the way that you disarm a cynic is not getting them to understand that you're not trying to necessarily change them with some sort of instruction.
Yeah.
And if, again, we've already mentioned this, that what you're doing is you're looking for genuineness, because if you don't get genuineness, it doesn't work. So what you've got to do is convince the cynic that it's the right thing to do rather than tell them. And the skill of that then comes in, there's two, isn't it? It's the skill that you two both have as trainers. So you're convincing, and the reason you're convincing is because you've got authenticity, because you are and always have been practitioners. So you two can tell me that you believe in a certain methodology, and I can sit cynically and say, well, what do you know? All you're doing is mooching around the place telling other people how to do it. But because I know that you might be doing it tomorrow yourselves, that it's hard to be a cynic.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to disagree with you, Jacob, when you're telling me something that you did yesterday. And for me, that authenticity in delivery and training, and authenticity, or the authenticity associated with your practice, is the way that we get through to the people who are the non-believers.
Yeah.
And so when somebody says to me, well, Dave, I think you're talking rubbish. Well, I say, well, you might think that, but this worked for me last week. That's different.
I think there's an element here of living and breathing the stuff that you're talking about. I suppose that's what I'm picking up from what you're saying there. Absolutely. I genuinely believe it. And it's, again, sort of circling back to some of the things that you've said already, but I do it. And I do believe in it as well. And I think ultimately, if I'm going to talk to somebody about it, I can't stand there and fake. You can't fake it. And there's an element of relational challenge and support in the moment if you're training somebody, or if you're having a conversation with somebody, or if you're working alongside somebody in the moment as well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think the way that is the way to work through any sort of cynicism that might be in the system, is to just keep doing what you're doing it well, and then actually you've got a genuine touch point that proves your practice. The other thing that I think is really important that I always say, and I know you two do too, is that this methodology, relational practice, isn't easy. It's actually easier to be a behaviorist from an adult's point of view, because you've got a list of rules that you stick to, and if the kid does as they're told, they get a reward. If they don't, they get a punishment. It's actually fairly easy, but it don't mean to say that it works, or that the end point for the children is the best outcome and end point for them.
Mr. Skinner said in his work, when he was manipulating behaviour of rats and pigeons, he even said in his work, as the guy that kind of came up with a lot of these ideas, that it won't be as effective with children and young people, because children and young people are far more complex than a rat and a pigeon. Yet, since he came out of that approach, most schools across, and me myself, like as parents as well, have used that approach.
Well, you look at the naughty step, right? So, if you're gonna do, the little kid does something wrong at home, they go and sit on the naughty step for 1 minute for however many years they are. So 7-year-old gets 7 minutes on the naughty step. Now, I got sucked into that methodology as a parent, right? But it's really, when I reflect on it, and I think of the naughty step. I used to get my kids, and mainly my eldest, because I don't think the youngest had to go on the naughty step because he always did as he was told. But my eldest used to go on the naughty step. But you know what I did as well? Even when he was small, I used to have a restorative conversation with him. He didn't just go on the naughty step for 7 minutes and then return back to work to his day-to-day life. I did a restorative practice course early in my leadership career, a 2-day course to become a restorative practitioner. And I took that off that course and used it with my own kids when they were little. And it worked an absolute treat because I had a proper discussion with them every single time whilst they were sitting on the naughty step. And now I reflect back, the naughty step was irrelevant. It was the conversation.
Yeah, the relational interaction, teaching him how to express himself in a different way the next time that feeling occurs.
Exactly.
Absolutely. The naughty step for me, so that reacting with that punitive measure just tries to spark fear in the young person. But equally, getting them to sit there and think about what they've done, they can't. Because if you cognitively, you can't think if you're stressed because that part of your brain's disengaged. So it's a bit of nonsense in that aspect there. There's also... there's nothing wrong with a timeout. Do you know what I mean? Giving a kid a space to go and sit and relax. But then what we should be doing is sitting with them and having a relational interaction and helping them regulate because young children can't self-regulate. You need to co-regulate before you can self-regulate.
And what it is, as well as I think back about my own parenting experiences at that time, and I was accidentally doing relational practice, even though I didn't know I was doing it in a way because I was allowing regulation. We were definitely co-regulating because I wasn't losing my rag with them. We were doing restorative conversations and we were keeping relationships intact and we were building trust. And we were doing that just through our own natural methodology that we'd introduced into the household, to get through those difficult years.
That last 2 minutes there, we've just summed up a lot of what relational practice looks like in action, haven't we? Just the story of your own kid, yeah.
Yeah, and even when my kids, when you get through into that difficult phase of having teenage kids, everything that we had to deal with was done through a relational and restorative based conversation that never damaged the relationship, even if it was difficult.
Yeah, and
most of it was about how it made other people feel. And getting that, that sort of deeper reflection that we ask children to do. And quite often I get people, and you'll have the same, people come back to me and say, well, we haven't got time to have restorative conversations with kids. I'm talking about a 2-minute conversation in many respects. I'm not talking about 45 minutes of hardcore restorative practice circles. We're talking about a restorative approach. And that, for me, that was key to what we used to do back in the day. If you remember, we didn't do restorative practice or restorative justice. We did a restorative approach, which means we culturally fitted into being restorative all the time. It wasn't based around a scripted restorative practice process.
More than just a set of questions.
Yes, more than
Absolutely.
Just questions. And I constantly used to hammer that and say, this is just the approach we take at this school, not a set of questions.
I'd be really interested. One of the things we started to do a little bit there, sort of one of the final things to touch on was what this values-based and sort of relational approach looks like through the lens of a couple of different people. We've done this from our perspective. So like when we've talked about the pupil that you both sort of talked about early on in the journey at that school, and a little bit of our perspective from some other scenarios and challenging staff and environment and ethos and things like that. But I'm interested as to how a relational or values-based approach looks for a pupil through their eyes, or looks through a parent through their eyes, and looks through a teacher's eyes, etc., etc.
I've had a couple of kids come up to me in the street when they've left school and they're a little bit older, and like they'll be with their mates or the family and things, and they go, "Oh, look, sir's there. He's all right. You're a bit strict, but he's all right." I kind of see that as almost like the balance that we were always looking for or aiming for, challenge and support. So again, people sometimes think that when you're working relationally with kids, it's really soft, and the kids don't see it as a soft approach in their eyes. They see you as a safe adult who's in charge, who puts boundaries and high expectations in place, but is flexible enough to support them and meet their need. And I think if you can get a kid to understand that, I hope that the kids that I've worked with anyway see it as that approach and from that perspective, rather than being the friend or being a really bossy adult.
I think what you've said, there's that little bit there that I'm just going to pick out what you just said then, Luke, and that was about being safe, right? And emotional safe. So again, guess what? Back to Rogers, creating an emotionally safe climate. So relational practice creates a safe place for children to get it wrong. And if it's safe to get it wrong, you've got a better chance of then putting it right over a long period of time, in my view. So what you will see in great relational sort of organizations, schools, be it whatever it might be, is you'll see children safely getting things wrong, and then it be dealt with in a really, really positive way. And it gets back to playing the long game. So what you're focusing on is getting it right over a long period of time, rather than using fear and compliance to get it right in one hit. So if a kid doesn't do their own work because they haven't done their own work, then an half an hour detention, will they always forevermore do their own work? Probably not, if they just don't do homework because they can't do homework and they struggle with homework. So for me, it's about understanding that it's safe for them not to do their own work, as long as we work with them to try and make sure that we can get them doing their own work.
It makes sense when you say it like that.
Yeah, and I know that sounds really simple, but you know, even when I was teaching in mainstream, I had a girl who didn't do her own work. Lovely kid. I think it's probably year 10 at the time. Didn't do her own work. Homework policy was, it was a zero tolerance homework policy. If you don't hand your homework in on the deadline, it's an automatic 30-minute detention after school. And Jacob's nodding because he went to that school, right? So,
and didn't do my own work.
And didn't do your own work. But this one girl didn't do her own work, and so I wanted to know why she hadn't done her own work. And the reason she didn't do her own work was that she couldn't concentrate because there was a car burning on the street outside the bedroom that night, and it's a bit distracting. You know, was she telling me lies? I don't think she was. Do I think that's a fair excuse for not doing your own work? Probably. You know, I'd probably want to move house, never mind not doing my own work if a car were burning on my street outside. Did I give her a detention? I'll let you decide that. It's not for me to go against the behaviour policy of the school. But it's that thing about understanding why we can help her do her homework, not just constantly punishing her for not doing it. And you've got to dig below the surface, haven't you? We talk about being curious. There's a lot to be said for that concept of being curious. Just ask a few questions. Why aren't they doing that? You know, or we talk about kids who throw chairs across classrooms. Why are they throwing a chair across a classroom? Because it ain't normal behaviour to throw a chair across a classroom. There's something emotionally causing a child to throw a chair across a classroom. So let's find out what that is as best we possibly can, rather than just seeing the flying chair.
Yeah, there's some really important bits there that I just want to repeat for people. The first one was sort of the element of safety, creating a safe space, not just physically, but obviously so that they can make mistakes. And I absolutely love the curiosity stuff as well. Trying seeking to understand, I think, is just so powerful. What about a parent? What does it look like through the lens of a parent?
So it's really hard. It's really hard because your parent automatically becomes wrapped in the welfare of just one child, right? So as a parent myself, but also working with many parents over time, the challenge that we've got with parents is parents themselves they're the first people who want to see revenge. So if your child, if you've got a child at school, Luke, and you get a phone call to say that when your Roxanne gets home tonight, she's got a black eye because somebody punched her in the face today at school. What happens, Luke, is all your years of relational training go out of the window, and you immediately say to that school, well, what are you doing about it? That kid needs to be excluded and placed in isolation for 7 days because they've hit my child. And that's the tester for your relational practitioner, is how do you convince a parent that actually that's not the right thing to do when that parent's daughter's got a black eye. I'm asking you that question, but I don't need an answer. But what I'm saying is that therefore, the parents do see it differently, and I've seen it differently, and you will see it differently when your kids are growing up and your kids are in school, because your first priority is the protection of your own child at all costs, and you've got to move away from your default setting to understand that actually there might be more to it than that. What you need to see is you need to see that exclusion, and that's why loads of families really love high excluding schools, because they see those schools as not putting up with anything. You know, I'm going to send my child to that school because if ever anything happens to my child, the other kids are going to be kicked out, and we're going to be happy. But it ain't that simple. So, getting back to your original question, how do you then deal with that? Well, that's just through constant education, constant conversations, but also finding a balance. This is why I don't say to schools, I don't say to schools, use a policy that says don't exclude. Because sometimes you've got different stakeholders and you've got to work through what's right for different stakeholders. But you've got to ultimately look at all the stakeholders, not just focus on one. No easy answer, and people are probably thinking I'm waffling around that, trying to get away with saying what it is, but it really is about trying to. Your relationships work at all levels, and your relationships with parents are actually just as important as your relationships with everybody else in the school, and how you showcase your school to your school community is really important as well, because they've got to trust you. So when we've got, I'm going back to our school, when we've got an SEMH school that's doing presentation evenings, presentation days, concerts, Christmas nativities, singings and concerts, where the parents come in and see how much the school cares, they see how much the staff care, they see the warmth in the building and the warmth in the school, that makes that conversation the next day with a parent so much easier when I say to them, you need to trust me on this one, we'll deal with it in a different way.
I think ultimately parents just want to know that kids are cared for and safe, don't they?
Yes.
One of the quickest ways to know that your kids feel safe can be, if there is high violence in a school, for example, is having high exclusions that match and marry that. And I get that. But like Dave said, I think it's about bringing them in and bringing them on board with the culture as well, trying to get the parents to be on board with the culture, which is a difficult thing as well, because naturally parenting is very behaviourist in its ways. Conversations, education, support, welcome them in, all those things.
I think the things that I'm picking up there on top of those that you've just wrapped up with there, Luke, is sort of creating a really trusting environment. And essentially the stuff that you describe for the pupil, you're doing with the parents as well.
Yeah.
So that relational model, just doing the same stuff again, I suppose. One of the last ones that I'm interested in, which again we have touched on briefly. Well, there's two, but we can sort of probably squeeze them in because I'm conscious of time a little bit here. Is through the eyes of the teacher and the leader in school. What does this approach look like and feel like? And I know we've done a little bit of this already, so we might not need to go on in too much. But what does that values approach, look like through the eyes of a teacher?
Well, I'm going to stick my neck out and say that if you get a value-driven sort of relational approach in a classroom environment, then your classroom will be a happier place. Because this warmth that we talked about, the warmth exists in a classroom, and I've seen warmth in classrooms flowing between teacher and pupil and backwards and forwards. I've also seen tension in classrooms with teachers who are ruling through fear. They're not enjoying what they're doing. They're clock watching, ready to get to the next break. The kids aren't enjoying it. They might be getting stuff done, but it's not. There's no warmth there. And I would argue that it's better to work in a warm environment than a cold environment. And you create warmth through relational practice, and you create cold through behaviourist practice. And sometimes people would argue that the behaviourist approach creates respect, but respect at what cost? Is it genuine respect? So I am, and this is extreme, but I'm using this extreme story as an example. When I was in what would probably be year 9, I used to have a maths teacher who, when we were doing our times tables, or, you know, that essentially was asking us maths questions, if you got it wrong, he would take you to the front of the class, you touch your toes, and he'd whack your backside with a meter ruler in front of the class, right? That was his modus operandi. We sat in that class fearing getting whacked, which did make us try to learn our times tables. But that class was a very, very unhappy class full of fear. Probably decent maths outcomes, right? But what was the cost of those decent maths outcomes? So when I spoke to my own dad about that, my dad, through his lens, saw that as being the class respecting the teacher, and he's earned respect because if you mess him about, he whacks you with a meter ruler. He was a bully. Quite plain and simple, a bully. He used to scare his class into compliance, and if they didn't comply with him, he would physically hit them. Now, there is no way you can describe that in any other way than a bully. But in the 1980s, that was respect. What a load of tosh. And so what you've got, you know, and if you take away the ruler and the touching your toes, and just take it back down to just scaring children into compliance by being mean, then it's exactly the same, isn't it? We're just taking the physical aspect away, and that's not an emotionally safe place to be. So teach, and I'm talking extremes. And then I can also give you examples of emotional connections between teachers and teachers and kids, where the kids are doing exactly as they've asked them to do because they've bought into the personality and the emotional connection of the teacher. The teacher's happy, the children are responding, the children are learning, and what that teacher is giving the kids is that just enough of them that they buy into them emotionally without it being inappropriate or unprofessional. And I've seen both ends of that spectrum. If I was doing training around this, I would say that you've got to move along that spectrum from wherever you are. So if you're right at the end, then you try and move further and further towards that relational end. And that's what you've got to try and do. And that gives you the idea of what relational practice must be like for a teacher. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think we're about finished. I was tempted to put you on the spot here, Dave, and ask you to see if you could sum up values-driven relational practice in one word. Is a bit hard, so one sentence.
Yeah, so you've got to live your values, because if you just say what they are, then you're not authentic and genuine. So you buy into it. It goes back to genuineness. You co-construct your values. You talk about what values you need to introduce into a school or an environment, and what I call your values equation. It's your values plus your values plus your values plus time equals culture. However, it's about lived values, not just values.
Spot on. The only thing we haven't mentioned here is you wrote a book about all this, didn't
you? I wrote a book about this that covers 25 years of all this stuff, and writing a book fills me with dread, absolute dread, until I actually started writing and thought, you know what? And it wasn't just about me, it was about us and what we do and about what every colleague I've ever worked with. You find you've got a lot to say because what you've done is really important. And so writing the book for me was something I thought I'd never do, ever in a million years. And getting to a point where you can put this down in practice, it's a celebration of not just me, it's a celebration of every colleague in every school I've ever worked in who's worked in a relational way, including you two.
Yeah, that's called the kindness principle. So make sure if you haven't already had a look at that, it's worth looking at. I know everybody I speak to says it's a really, really influential book. Thank you for giving.
I've read it, Jacob. Is that what you're saying?
I'm trying to get some commission on for it. Is it working?
You need me to give you a free copy, Jacob?
No, I want it signed though. Honestly, that would be brilliant. I don't know about you, Luke, but I found that really, really interesting. So hopefully people will watch that. Appreciate
Thanks for giving up your time, and I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. And obviously, we've spoke to you. I mean, we've known you for years, so we've heard you say these things, but we've seen it in action. And I suppose not just a thanks for the conversation, but a thanks from me and Jacob personally as well, and things that you've done for us, and being a relational leader and kind of, I suppose, inspiring us to go down that path as well. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure working with you, lads. But it always is. And even these conversations that we start to have, whether they're on camera or off camera, we could just talk for hours about it, can't we? Because we've got lots to talk about because of the work that we do.